Hello and welcome back to the Independent Pianist. It is I, your host, Cole Anderson. Unfortunately, I don't have any music for you this week. I still haven't received the videos for any of my most recent concert performances. I had a couple of them that I did want to upload at some point. I do have a few recordings that I've made that I'm going to post in analysis form. So I have the Rhapsody Opus 119 No. 4 by Brahms. I'm halfway through recording Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, and I'm also currently working on the Liszt Sonata, none other, as well as a couple of smaller Chopin etudes and a Liszt song transcription. But unfortunately, none of that is video-worthy yet, and I've been just kind of overwhelmed with work and practicing lately, and I just haven't had the bandwidth to prepare any of that for posting, or to put in the effort necessary for any of my long-form style videos where I compare and analyze various recordings or great performances from the past. However, I didn't want to let another week go by without putting up a video for you guys. I know I missed a video a couple weeks back, and I hate it when that happens. So today I decided just to take a little bit of a look into comment sections on older videos and see if there was anything interesting in there that I could share with you guys. Perhaps questions that I could answer. And I did find some very interesting things, some things that were hilarious, some things that were just very interesting and that I thought I could clarify a little bit. So here's a few of the things that I found. Let's just dive right in and I will share some of these things with you. First and foremost, I got a lot of very entertaining replies to my video on Chopin's Opus 10 No. 2 recently. Just to remind you, this was not a video of my own performance of Chopin Opus 10 No. 2. Instead, it was a comparison of a few different versions of it at various tempi and things that I liked about one version in particular by the Ukrainian pianist Vitaly Margulis. Now, somewhat foolishly in retrospect, in the title of that video, I suggested that this etude was in fact the most difficult of Chopin's 27 etudes for the piano. Oh boy, did I get a veritable slew of responses explaining to me how this was in fact not the most difficult Chopin etude, and how insert your favorite Chopin etudes of great difficulty was actually the most difficult one. And at first glance, this may seem to be just kind of funny. I mean, obviously, how can you decide what is the most difficult etude? It's going to be different for every person. However, there was such a lot of discussion about this, and some of it very spirited, that I thought it'd be worth just talking briefly about why I chose that one as my most difficult, and why you might choose others, and for what reason you would make that distinction, and what that distinction even means at all when you talk about a difficult piece of piano music. The great pianist Louis Kentner had this saying that all piano music is either easy or impossible, and that practicing is the process of bringing things from the latter category into the former. And in large part, I agree with that, with a small caveat. Certain pieces which are of great technical difficulty, even after they are learned and totally smooth so that you know them like the back of your hand, I think for most people will still require a bit of daily practice in order to keep them at performance readiness. So most Chopin etudes, if I were going to perform them, I would feel like I'd want to be spending a little bit of time practicing them each day to feel at my best in a performance. Certainly I'd want to be practicing them the last couple days before a big concert. Fair enough, right? That doesn't mean that you need to spend a lot of time on them, but just going over them a little bit slowly, maybe with some rhythms and so forth, is generally all you really need to keep things in performance trim. So when I talk about how a certain piece of music is the most difficult piece that I've played, I'm usually talking about the amount of time that it took me to master that piece in proportion to its length. So to a certain degree, of course, if a piece is long, you expect that it's going to take you a fair amount of time to learn it. Not all long pieces are made equal, though, and it doesn't take as long from a technical perspective to master a 40-minute Schubert sonata, for example, as it would to master Beethoven's Hammerklavier sonata, which is the same length, but far more technically involved. In the same vein, if you're playing a piece like Debussy's Girl with the Flaxen Hair, or something like that, that's about the same length as a typical Chopin etude, but it's going to take you far less time over the course of days and weeks to actually master the piece. So that's why I chose Chopin's Opus 10 No. 2 as the most difficult piece. It's because I've never actually performed that piece. Or actually, now that I say that, maybe I did perform it once. I think I did perform it on one concert, and I was so freaked out about playing it on that one concert that I haven't played it since. That was a long time ago, though. I have progressed a lot since that time. I think that was like 20 years ago when I played that on one concert when I was a teenager. And I've recently been picking it up again. That's one of the pieces I'm practicing right now. And I'm just amazed at how long it's taken me to feel comfortable with it. I have it at speed now. I only really wanted to play it at about 144 for the quarter note, which is Chopin's metronome marking. But even successfully playing it at speed, I still don't feel like I quite have the technique down to the fine point that it requires to really make it sound good. So for example, the little chords that you have to play in this etude with the thumb and first finger of your right hand, I'm not always getting them yet so that they land exactly in the right place. Sometimes it's disturbing the legato in the chromatic scale with the third, fourth, and fifth fingers. I haven't quite figured out how to get the pedaling to work quite right so that it doesn't get too blurry, but at the same time it has kind of an atmosphere. There are all these questions, both musical and technical, which are really quite difficult to resolve in this etude, way out of proportion for its very brief length. Now, of course, that's just for me, though. I'm sure there's other people who will have much less problems with this etude. Personally, I don't really put much store in anyone who says that it was easy for them, although I suppose anything's possible. Maybe your hand would just be very well suited to this particular technique and you would just learn it with no effort whatsoever. However, I imagine most people are going to have to put in quite a bit of practicing for quite a bit of time to play it. The exact amount, though, is going to vary. And just to show how different this is, I mean, every single etude you could imagine was chosen by various people commenting on that video as being the most difficult. Some people said Opus 10 No. 1, which I also find to be very difficult. Some people chose Opus 10 No. 11, the Arpeggio etude, which was very surprising to me. It's certainly difficult, but I would never have imagined it as being the most difficult. But then again, I do have kind of big hands, so wide-spaced arpeggios like that are actually not so much of a problem for me, although they're still hard and everything. One commenter told me, let me know that Hans von Bülow considered Opus 10 No. 10 to be the most difficult. That wouldn't seem obvious to me, even though it is very acrobatic in its own way. A much more obvious choice, Opus 25 No. 6, the etude in double thirds. That's a very difficult etude to play convincingly, and it gets very difficult very quickly depending on how fast you want to play it. I have to say that having practiced them both, I've never performed the etude in thirds, and I haven't actively been practicing it recently, although it will be coming up here pretty soon. The thing that really struck me about it before when I was practicing it was that there were many places in that piece which are not particularly difficult, but then there were one or two places that were so hard that it was quite daunting. But with the Etude Opus 10 No. 2, it's kind of just hard all the way through and quite daunting. The technique is also related because you're using the third and fourth, 3, 4, and 5 on the right hand to play chromatic scales in both etudes. It's just in the etude in thirds, of course, you're also playing another line below the chromatic scale. Some people chose The Winter Wind, Opus 25 No. 11, which is also reasonable. There, the problem is really stamina. Just getting through the piece without your hand falling to pieces is very, very difficult. That was what I struggled with at first when I was recording it for this channel. It took me several weeks before I felt like I could just play it through comfortably without my hand feeling like it was just going to fall off. However, the main figuration wasn't that difficult to learn for me. Kind of similar, I was surprised that someone said they felt Opus 10 No. 4 was the most difficult etude, but that could certainly be the case for some people. This etude might actually be easier for people with smaller hands because a lot of the figuration requires you to really bunch your hand up very close together in order to play it successfully. However, I'm practicing that one actively right now, and I've basically got it learned already, even though I started it quite a bit later than I did Opus 10 No. 2. It's basically almost ready to record right now. So for me, at least, I couldn't really call that the most difficult etude of all, since it's fallen into my fingers pretty easily. I think you can also get an idea about which etudes are the most difficult for the most number of pianists by the ones which get performed more often. So you'll hear Opus 10 No. 4, the Black Keys, Opus 10 No. 8, Opus 25 No. 1. You'll hear those etudes played all the time. Pianists love those pieces. They feature them as encores or on their programs all the time. But outside of traversals of the complete Chopin etudes, you'll actually rarely hear Opus 10 No. 2, the Etude in Thirds, even Opus 10 No. 1. They don't get played that often, just by the occasional pianist who feels really comfortable with them. Even some famous virtuosi like Arthur Rubinstein or Vladimir Horowitz never played any of those etudes I just mentioned in public. I did get this one comment that said that I should make a channel for bedtime storytelling, ASMR. So I'll have to think about that. I do like reading poetry and stories out loud, so yes, that might be my next channel that I'm going to start. So moving on to some comments that were on other issues. This is actually from the same video. Oh my gosh. Yes, this commenter, Autogato, might be a play on words on affogato, I'm not sure, wrote, "I understand from your presentation that very interesting and impressive, in quotes, should be understood as, please do not play what Chopin wrote, in capital letters. Kudos. That's maybe why you are, who the expletive are you, and Pellini is Pellini. But of course you know better than Pellini and Chopin. Bravo!" And with 8 exclamation points. That's actually not exactly what I was trying to say. I was not trying to say that you should actively try to go against Chopin's notation. However, I think it's worth pointing out that in Margulis's version of that etude, in which he does bring out some inner voices and plays with some variety of tempi and pedaling that's not actually explicitly notated, he's not actually going against anything which is explicitly written in the score. And it's well documented that in Chopin's time, in his own performances, that he would do things that were not exactly notated in the music. There's the famous story about how one of his students noted that his performances of a Chopin mazurka oftentimes would make it sound almost as if the mazurka was in 4 instead of 3, because he took such a remarkable amount of time. You know, in a mazurka, generally the second or third beat is oftentimes extended considerably, and Chopin obviously did this in his performances. That's something which would be very difficult or impossible to notate. And in general, certain subtleties of rubato, which Chopin is reported to have asked from his students, where the right hand is very free and doesn't quite line up with the left hand, would be impossible to notate. So this is just another example of where things can be brought out of the music without violating the composer's intentions, because the composer's intentions only go so far towards bringing the music to real life in the moment. So here's a comment which brings up a very interesting point. Someone left this on my video about Sviatoslav Richter. The person says, Richter did not add something to scores. Please listen to Rock 2. There are many special places where he plays very differently than Rachmaninoff himself. I think I said something to the effect that Richter had the idea that a performer is supposed to be a mirror of the composer's intention and is not supposed to add anything or take anything away from the printed score. And this was indeed Richter's philosophy. I also went out of my way in that video to say that Richter did not really realize that in performance. That in performance, he could oftentimes give the impression that he was doing something very different with the score from what the composer intended, without actually blatantly disregarding anything that was printed. And you can see that with his incredible choice of tempi in certain movements, including his choice of tempi for the opening of Schubert's B-flat major sonata or his G major sonata, in which molto moderato becomes a very slow tempo indeed. Now here, though, this is quite interesting because it is perfectly true that Richter plays very differently from Rachmaninoff himself. At the same time, it's worth pointing out that Rachmaninoff plays very differently from how he marked his score for the second concerto. And that here, the person who's really doing something different from the score was Rachmaninoff himself. Richter actually plays very much faithfully to Rachmaninoff's markings for the most part. As far as I recall, I haven't heard the recording in a while, but from what I remember, he was pretty literal about trying to bring out most of the markings that Rachmaninoff actually wrote. Rachmaninoff himself was not so much like this. Although everything Rachmaninoff would write in a score was very logical and would add up to a very cohesive structure in the end, in his own performances, it would seem sometimes that Rachmaninoff was completely rethinking the way he wanted to structure his own compositions, and came up with an alternative scheme for many of the dynamics and tempi from what he originally put in the score. And it would oftentimes work just as well or better. He didn't only do that with his own music, by the way. He did that with other composers' music, too. Just listen to his very interesting but very daring performance of Chopin's B-flat minor sonata. He follows the lead of Anton Rubinstein in the Funeral March and reorchestrates it into a gradual crescendo in the opening and a gradual diminuendo at the ending, which is not marked by Chopin, but which works very well in its own way, and many other changes as well. So a very interesting thing here, but the commenter may have misunderstood slightly what I was trying to say. I was more commenting on Richter's own philosophy. And this was a very interesting comment that came up recently on one of my videos from a while ago. This was my video about how important it is to grade repertoire gradually harder when you're in the kind of beginner to intermediate stage of piano learning. So this commenter says, I have experience with this. I played an incredibly hard piece for the longest time, and eventually I was able to play it after much time. And pretty well, I admit. I thought that this would make things much easier for less technically difficult repertoire. Boy, was I wrong. I now have a bizarrely uneven foundation where gnarly things are easier for me, but I struggle with elementary fingerwork in more pianistic works by Mozart, for example. What do you think is a sufficient amount of foundational repertoire before tackling harder stuff? In other words, etudes, classical sonatas, etc. This is a fascinating thing because it shows how hard it is to define what is technically difficult. And in fact, my teacher when I was in high school, the wonderful virtuoso Mark Salmon, who was a Juilliard student in the 80s, would tell me that oftentimes pianists who felt very comfortable playing a Rachmaninoff concerto would feel very scared of playing a Mozart concerto. And we would normally think of Rachmaninoff as being far more difficult than Mozart. And in many ways, he is. But in Mozart's music, there is a kind of clarity. There is a way that you are exposed to view, which can be very frightening if you're not used to it. Also, I think it's worth pointing out, even if you do play a very, very difficult piece like a Rachmaninoff concerto pretty well, there may be details of technique which are kind of missing, but which we don't notice so much. You know, if you play with enough pedal, if you play with enough passion and enough sweep, you might be able to kind of disguise the places where there's a little bit of weakness in finger technique, or there's a little bit of imprecision in articulation, or so forth and so on. But those sorts of little weaknesses and drawbacks in the technical equipment will come out right away in a Mozart sonata. So a Mozart sonata is not necessarily as difficult as a Rachmaninoff concerto using the rubric that I was talking about earlier. It won't necessarily take you as long to learn one, but there are certain little pieces of technique there which, if you do not properly learn them first, are actually going to be kind of difficult to put in place later. So I oftentimes found myself, sometimes unsuccessfully, trying to convince people to, yes, keep learning some classical sonatas, keep learning some earlier repertoire like that, because you're going to really use the same techniques when you play the bigger pieces, the Beethoven sonatas, the Rachmaninoff preludes, and so forth. So what's the sufficient amount of foundational repertoire to tackle? That's hard to say. I don't think you can give a set amount for every person. I would say that once you get to a point where you feel pretty darn comfortable playing a sonata by Mozart, for example, or a fugue by Bach, when you don't have any fear, at least in a technical point of view, playing these pieces, then you're probably in a pretty good place. And I think that actually the technique of the classical era and the Baroque era, it serves as a foundation for the Romantic era, but it also works both ways. So once you feel pretty good playing this kind of more foundational repertoire, once you have a few classical sonatas under your belt that you can play with a good deal of clarity, you can go and try to play some of these bigger romantic things, And then you can also come back, keep coming back to the classical era sonatas and so forth. And you'll find that your technique improves both directions from this. And it's good anyway to give yourself a little bit of a refreshment. Sometimes it'll be better for you to be working on these more logical, clear pieces. Sometimes it'll be better for you to be challenging yourself with the big romantic works or the 20th century works. It's not really that it has to be always a straight line. I think that it is definitely a good idea to learn 4 or 5 classical sonatas and maybe the same number of Bach preludes and fugues or something comparable to that, Scarlatti sonatas, what have you, before you get into trying to play some of the bigger romantic works. But again, it's hard to really say definitely the exact number of pieces you need to learn before you try anything else. Oh yes, this was a comment on one of my videos about Liszt. Sorry, Liszt is often bombastic, and he also pushed minimal material beyond what it could support. When young Brahms made his pilgrimage to Weimar, Liszt performed his new B minor sonata, and Brahms fell asleep. This is actually a very funny story about Brahms. He was on a concert tour with the Hungarian violinist whose name escapes me at the moment, but they went to Weimar because this violinist was friends with Liszt. Liszt performed his B minor sonata, and Brahms apparently fell asleep, and it was very embarrassing. Brahms apologized profusely, but Liszt was a little bit upset, but at the end of the day, they parted as friends. It's entirely possible that Brahms fell asleep because he was really tired, because he was traveling a lot at that time, and travel was very difficult in those days. It was not like now, and it's hard enough now. You'll feel tired after flying on a plane, but just imagine riding on a bumpy stagecoach for hours and hours and hours, going from village to village and city to city. So we don't know if it's really because Brahms didn't like the music, although that would be logical enough as well. Worth noting that Brahms wrote a piece not long after this, the F-sharp minor sonata, the second sonata, piano sonata, that definitely seems like it might be more than a little bit of an homage or inspired by Liszt's B minor sonata. So, I don't know if this is necessarily an indication of anything. Also, the B minor sonata is generally regarded as being one of the masterpieces of 19th century piano music, which I certainly agree with that. And I'll be making a video pretty soon in which I perform the piece, in which I also point out the brilliance of its musical construction and the logic of its construction. So again, about Liszt being bombastic, you do hear this a lot. And I've always found, as I've mentioned earlier, that Liszt seems to be far more tasteful than his interpreters. Because you'll oftentimes see that Liszt will write something which actually makes a lot of sense. For example, he might write a tempo indication like allegretto. You might not realize this, but the Etude La Campanella is marked allegretto. The Faux-Follet Etude from the Transcendental Etudes is marked allegretto. Do pianists usually play these pieces allegretto? No. They generally play them as fast as they possibly can. The same thing with dynamics. Oftentimes Liszt will carefully grade his dynamics across a piece of music, and performers don't always pay attention to those things at all. Same with his use of register. There's a place in the Liszt sonata where Liszt very carefully avoids using the lowest bass notes because he doesn't want to sound too bombastic early in the piece. And what do most pianists do? They add those notes in and pound them out for good measure, making it sound way more bombastic than it actually is in the score. Since I'm actually practicing the Liszt sonata, I did just go and listen to a few pianists playing the final octaves. I just was curious to see what kind of tempo gradation was common in those last prestissimo octaves and the big climax near the end of the piece. And there was a wide range. On the lower end, there were people like Stephen Huff and Claudio Arrau, who were around 112 to 116 or so for a half note. And then there were people like the young Vladimir Horowitz or Yuzhou Wang, who were playing it around 136 or something like that for a half note. Very, very fast. And Liszt doesn't specify the speed. He just basically says as fast as you can. What that means, of course, is hard to define. But one thing he doesn't mark is actually to play this passage with a ton of pedal. And I noticed that the versions which play it very fast and also just pedal it all the time sound very bombastic. They sound very bangy and loud, but not all versions sound like that. So again, I tend to think that it's not so much a problem with Liszt, it's the problem with thrill-seeking young pianists having fun with this music at the expense of its musical value. Well, here's another interesting one. This is about Claudio Arrau. I was talking about him as a Liszt player. I really admire a lot of Arrau's Liszt recordings. Harold Schoenberg, in his book The Great Pianists, said that to perform Liszt's piano music to have its greatest effect, the pianist needs to throw caution to the wind and play with abandon. Schoenberg said that those pianists who are afraid to take chances and do everything in a measured, pre-planned way can never be great Liszt players. What's interesting is that Arrau's playing was typically like that. Arrau seemed to play everything, including Liszt, in a measured, pre-planned way with very little spontaneity. So, first off, I could say a lot about Harold Schoenberg. He was a famous music critic during the 20th century, and he did write this book, The Great Pianists, which I am forever grateful to because it really got me into listening to historical era pianists, and it really fired a lot of my imagination for getting interested in piano music and for learning about piano music. However, you could have plenty to say that's negative about that book. Maybe I'll do a book review at some point and talk about the pros and cons of the things that Schoenberg says. He could be a wonderfully penetrating critic, and at other times he could be strangely ignorant of certain things or dismissive in a way that was not very thoughtful or not very well measured at all. And I would say that those who are not afraid to take chances will definitely do well in certain Liszt pieces, but there are other pieces where the kind of pre-planned way of playing might be very, very beneficial, and it might work very, very well. Not all of Liszt's pieces necessarily need someone who's going to throw caution to the wind all the time. However, I think the main thing to take issue with here is that Arrau's playing was always planned and not spontaneous. You might get that impression to a certain degree from listening to his studio recordings. I think Arrau was someone who tended to play better in live concert. But luckily, there's a lot of live recordings of him. There are also his studio recordings from his youth, which are much more spontaneous and sparkling in their way. I only have to think about live recordings like his 2 Brahms concerti that he recorded while he was in Russia. I believe it was in Moscow. And those are incredible, earth-shattering performances, which absolutely, he just sweeps everything away in those performances and just takes hold of the works by the throat. And it's really, really thrilling. And there's many other live performances like that. Arrau would probably remind you more of someone like Marta Argerich at times when he really got into things in live performance. He could be very wild and very spontaneous indeed. I think that he respected the music so much and he cared about the music so much that in studio recordings he sometimes did have this very, very serious sound, and he would pull things back a little bit and try to be very structured in his approach. Very similar actually to Arthur Rubinstein, someone that you might see as a very different artist, but Rubinstein also had a very freewheeling approach in his live concerts, but oftentimes in his studio recordings he would be very, very delicate and very precise and kind of hold things back quite a bit. To be honest, I think both approaches have their merit. Perhaps a judicious blending of the two is the best, and you get that sometimes in their studio recordings and sometimes in their live recordings. It's really hard to choose. So that's just my 2 thoughts on this. Of course, not everyone's going to like Arrau's Liszt. That's okay. Oh yes, I'm very surprised after all these years, I finally got a question asking me what the heck does my channel name mean? Independent of what? Asks Dacer. I don't know what that tag signifies, but good question. Independent of what? Yeah, when I started this channel, it was during COVID. I was kind of at loose ends at a turning point in my life, and I was trying to decide what I wanted to do with myself. To put this in context, I graduated from my doctorate in 2016, and normally the track for a pianist who gets a doctorate is to apply to every university, conservatory, college that they possibly can and try to get a position on a faculty somewhere, and then gradually get better and better positions to get tenure, and that's generally considered to be the proper track to follow. For whatever reason, perhaps it was partly lack of enthusiasm, perhaps it was just a poor job market, I had not done that up to that point over those 4 years. I had had some small positions. I was a sabbatical replacement once at a small liberal arts college. I gave classes, master classes at various schools. I still do that sometimes. But I didn't feel very enthusiastic about becoming a professor of music anywhere, and that hadn't panned out for me yet. So when COVID hit and I was kind of at this loose end trying to figure out what to do next, I was just trying to decide, what is my brand going to be? What is my MO going to be? What am I really going to try to do with my life? And I think I decided that I really wanted to be a little bit of a free spirit. I wanted to be independent of an institution. I wanted to be independent of anyone who would be necessarily telling me what to do or what kind of music to play or how to be creative. I wanted to just figure all that stuff out for myself and kind of do my own thing. So that's what I've been doing ever since. Over the past 4 years or so, I've been independent. I've been a freelance, free contracting artist, kind of making my living, doing many different things, practicing a lot, performing a lot as much as I can, and also doing this wonderful YouTube channel where I get to talk to all of you interesting people, music lovers out there. So I'm really glad that I followed this. It's just my own way that I've decided to go, and I don't promise that I will stick to it forever. If I got some kind of cushy professorship tomorrow, maybe I would go for that. I don't know. But for now, I've been enjoying what I've been doing and doing pretty well. Oh, sorry. This is going back to that Chopin Etude video. This was just kind of interesting. Opus 10 number 2 is nowhere near the hardest. The hardest one of all has fast descending thirds accompanied by fast extended arpeggios in the left hand. Vladimir Ashkenazy played the piece and left out the left hand while playing the thirds. Now that's what I call hard, not arguing with Vlad. This is actually not an etude. The commenter is referring to the last of Chopin's preludes, which does have a notorious passage with double thirds in the right hand. It's this one right here. This is very difficult. It's actually... I would not necessarily call this as difficult as anything that happens in Opus 10 number 2 or Opus 25 number 6 or any other really hard Chopin etudes. This is one very difficult passage, but it is doable, and I'm sure Vladimir Ashkenazy could play it perfectly. Probably sometimes he might have messed it up. I mean, that probably happens. The left hand is actually not that hard. It's really the right hand with the thirds that's very difficult. So that's usually where you'll hear people come to grief a little bit. I think there might be a recording by Anders Schiff where he simplifies it into single notes or something like that. Which, fair enough. If your thirds don't feel very comfortable, that probably would be the best solution if you're going to play the piece at all. Here's a good one. Someone commenting on my live performance that included Ravel's Miroir. Would you be able to do a video sometime on how best to practice and indeed attempt the glissando thirds in the Alborada? And actually, there's not much to say about how to do glissando thirds. I think many people actually overestimate how difficult these sort of things are. There is one prerequisite, which is that you do have a piano on which the edges of the keys are properly sanded so that the edges are kind of soft. For a long time, I was playing on a piano where the edges of the keys were not like this, and it was very hard to do a double note glissando. As long as the tuner has done their due diligence in doing this, you should be fine in attempting them. The basic idea with glissando thirds is the same as anything, actually, any glissando. You want to minimize the amount to which your skin is touching the key. So that means that the finger in which the nail is going to be touching the keys should only be the nail touching the key. So you should be having the third finger when you're going up. The third finger should be as straight up and down as possible, so that you're not dragging your flesh across the side of the keys. That is the path to pain, and it can be avoided if you do a little bit of finagling and figure out how to do this. You don't actually have to have your fingers too deep into the keys to do a successful glissando. You can be a little bit more on top of the keys as well. That also helps to make it much less painful. If you have the right ratio of length among your fingers, you might be able to do it the way Sviatoslav Richter did it. He actually turned his hand over. I don't know if I can do it in this video, but it was like this. He plays them like this. If you watch a video of him playing them on YouTube, you can see that he does the ascending ones with his hand turned over, and the second and third finger is playing them this way. And then he goes back to doing it normally, coming down. So there's not really any secret besides that. If you can master these little things of not being too deep into the keys and keeping the finger with the nail touching the edge of the keys as straight up and down as possible, you should be able to do them without that much pain as long as the piano is set up properly. Okay, my last one. This was when I was talking about the piano that I use in my videos, which is a Kawai VPC1, a wonderful, wonderful virtual piano controller that I've used for all my videos, practically. It does have a heavier action, and this person said, oh, so do you recommend practicing on heavier pianos, keyboard pianos? And I absolutely do. I cannot overstate how much of an advantage this is. If you can practice on a piano with a heavier action, it's going to give you so much more comfort when you actually go to perform. Most pianos in concert venues are not going to be that heavy, but if you are used to playing on a much heavier action, first off, your tempi are generally going to be more controlled, so that's all to the good, but also you're just going to feel so relaxed and like it's so easy and just like flying on a lighter piano. It's exactly the same logic as working out with a weighted vest or something like that. You know, after you take it off, you just feel so light and easy. So that is my recommendation, if at all possible. That's why I actually rather like pianos like a Kawai for practicing, even if I don't always love their sound. The slightly stiffer action really trains you very well for performance. All right, so that's about it. That took a surprisingly long time for me to get through all those, but I know that I can go on and on and on when I have my way. So anyway, I hope that some of that was interesting to hear. By next week, I should actually have another performance video for you of some kind, so we'll be getting back to that. And I'm working hard on Rhapsody in Blue and the Liszt Sonata, so don't worry, they're coming up. It's going to be some action-packed musical videos pretty soon. All right, so everyone take care, keep practicing, stay safe out there over this whole election week, and I'll see you next week for some more music and conversation.